John's farm, a quaint little plot of land nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy rural town, had always been his sanctuary, a place where time seemed to slow down and where the simple pleasures of life reigned supreme. In this rustic paradise, John, an unassuming yet sharp-witted man, spent his days tending to his beloved goats and nurturing an old barn that carried the echoes of generations past. The barn, with its weathered wooden planks and creaking beams, was as much a character in the story as any living soul. It had witnessed the comings and goings of every curious creature and even a few eccentric human visitors over the years. However, none of these events compared to the uproar that was about to unfold, all thanks to one very special person, Karen. Karen was not your average townsperson. She was a self-declared queen of her domain, with an air of haughty superiority and a penchant for making decisions on behalf of everyone. Whether invited or not, Karen had, over the years, carved out a reputation as the arbiter of taste and the enforcer of her own bizarre social order. In the eyes of many in the community, she was both admired and secretly ridiculed, a paradoxical figure who embodied both charm and a flair for the dramatic. To Karen, however, the nuances of local opinion were of little consequence. Her word was law, and she would stop at nothing to maintain her imaginary crown. John, on the other hand, had long grown accustomed to the whims of nature and the unpredictable antics of his goats. The animals, spirited and mischievous, were as independent as their owner, a perfect match in a world where both resisted conformity in their own ways. Their bleats and playful scampers provided a constant soundtrack to the rhythm of the farm life, which was as chaotic as it was endearing. Yet, as fate would have it, the delicate balance of this pastoral idyll was destined to be disrupted by the impending collision of two irreconcilable forces, the grounded pragmatism of John and the unbridled arrogance of Karen. The story of our unlikely confrontation begins on a bright spring morning, when the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers and the promise of a new beginning. John was up at dawn, as usual, with a steaming cup of coffee in hand and a determined glint in his eyes. He strolled through the farm, checking on his goats who seemed to be planning their next mischief. There was a certain rhythm to the farm life that John cherished, a rhythm that Karen, with her penchant for chaos and disruption, was about to shatter. Karen's arrival in the community had been nothing short of a spectacle. With her perfectly coiffed hair, designer outfits, and a collection of accessories that screamed opulence, she had paraded into town like a celebrity in a small-town drama. Her opinions, loud and unwavering, were often delivered with a pointed smile that suggested she knew exactly what was best for everyone. From local politics to the proper way to trim a hedge, Karen had a comment on it all, and she dispensed her judgments as though she were doling out pearls of wisdom to the less enlightened masses. For John, Karen's interference in community affairs was more than just a nuisance. It was a personal affront to the natural order of things. Here was a woman who fancied herself as the guardian of local decorum, yet she seemed oblivious to the fact that the real pulse of the town lay in its authentic, unpolished character. In the quiet corners of his mind, John harbored a simmering disdain for Karen's pomposity. While he found solace in the gentle chaos of his farm, Karen thrived on creating artificial order out of the simple, beautiful disorder that defined rural life. This morning, however, as John strolled around, he noticed something amiss near the barn. The old structure, which had been a reliable witness to his daily routines, was now adorned with garish decorations that clashed horrendously with its rustic charm. Banners and streamers, clearly not of the farm's modest style, fluttered in the breeze. At first, John assumed it might be a local festival, a temporary burst of community celebration. But his instincts, honed by years of living in tune with nature's subtleties, told him otherwise. With a slow, deliberate pace, John made his way towards the barn, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the unmistakable signature of Karen's meddling. It wasn't long before he spotted her. Karen, resplendent in an outfit that could only be described as over the top, standing proudly amidst the chaos, barking out orders to a group of bewildered helpers. Her smile, wide and self-satisfied, was as infuriating as it was comical. She had declared the barn the venue for an extravagant wedding, and she hadn't bothered to ask John for permission. a fact that, to John, was the ultimate betrayal. It was at that moment that the absurdity of the situation truly sank in. Here was Karen, a woman whose presence in the community was as divisive as it was flamboyant, transforming John's humble barn into a stage for her grandiose vision of perfection. The barn, which had been a haven of simplicity and quiet resilience, was now a backdrop for a spectacle that seemed designed to mock everything John held dear. The sheer audacity of it all ignited a spark of defiance in him. A spark that, unbeknownst to Karen, would soon kindle the flames of an unforgettable revenge. John's internal monologue was as biting as his exterior calm. How dare she, he thought, disrupting the natural order of my farm with her ostentatious display of self-importance. Karen's insensitivity to the sanctity of his personal space was an affront to the very essence of rural living. In a world that often revered nature's quiet dignity, Karen's actions were a jarring reminder that some people preferred the theatrical over the genuine. Her deliberate invasion of his peaceful domain was not just an act of hubris. It was an invitation to a battle of wits and wills. The stage was set. In the face of Karen's well-meaning but disastrously misguided attempt to impose her vision on his land, John found himself at a crossroads. Would he allow his cherished farm to be hijacked by this embodiment of pretentiousness, or would he rise up, armed with nothing but his wit, a few mischievous goats, and an unyielding sense of justice? As the morning light danced on the dew-covered grass, the answer was clear. John would not stand idly by. In that quiet, tension-filled moment, the farm transformed into a battleground of ideologies. A clash between the natural, unscripted life of the countryside and the manufactured grandeur of Karen's ambitions. While Karen reveled in her self-appointed authority, the rustic spirit of the farm, embodied by John and his indomitable goats, was preparing to reclaim its dignity in the most unexpected and humorous fashion. The morning after John discovered Karen's audacious takeover of his barn, the sun rose with an almost mocking cheerfulness. It was as if nature itself had been in on Karen's grand scheme, a wedding extravaganza that she declared, without so much as a by your leave, would take place in John's humble barn. The barn, a rustic relic of simpler times, was now dressed up in an array of gaudy decorations that clashed violently with its weathered charm. Karen had transformed the once quiet barn into a carnival of excess. Everywhere one looked, there were glittering banners and streamers of every color imaginable, hung precariously on rickety beams and uneven walls. The barn's natural patina was assaulted by neon lights that blinked in patterns so dizzying they could easily pass as avant-garde art, if not for the fact that they were clearly out of place in a rural setting. Inflatable arches and plastic flowers, items more suited for a suburban shopping mall's grand opening, lined the entrance, welcoming guests with a forced cheer that only deepened John's simmering irritation. From the outset, it was evident that Karen's vision of a wedding was not one of subtle elegance but of extravagant bombast. The aisle was paved with a mix of old hay bales and inexplicably red carpet remnants, creating a bizarre pathway that led straight to a makeshift altar. The altar itself was a curious juxtaposition of tradition and tackiness. White lace tablecloths draped over wooden crates, centerpieces overflowing with fake roses and plastic peonies that wilted almost instantly under the barn's harsh fluorescent lighting. Guests began to arrive in a procession that was as peculiar as the setting. The invitation list seemed to have been compiled from the most eccentric corners of Karen's social circle. There was Charles, a self-proclaimed connoisseur of vintage wines, who arrived clutching a bottle of what he claimed was the nectar of the gods, though it smelled suspiciously of industrial cleaning agents. Then there was Elizabeth, an overly dramatic theater actress whose every entrance was accompanied by a flurry of compliments and theatrical gasps. And let's not forget Thomas, a self-appointed expert on etiquette, whose rigid adherence to protocol was both impressive and laughable in the face of such absurdity. The guests' attire did little to help the situation. Many showed up in outfits that screamed overcompensation. Men in tuxedos that had seen better days and women in gowns that sparkled so intensely they could have blinded anyone who dared to look directly at them. Each guest's appearance seemed to be a conscious effort to outdo one another in flamboyance, turning the wedding into a contest of ostentation. Their interactions were laced with a mix of sycophantic praise and thinly veiled ridicule, a social dance that mirrored the chaos of the event itself. Amid the clamor of polite conversation and forced laughter, the vows were about to be exchanged. The officiant, a local pastor who had been reluctantly roped into the affair, stood at the altar with a face that betrayed both bemusement and resignation. His voice, thick with sarcasm, carried across the barn as he recited the well-rehearsed lines, each word dripping with a flavor of irony that only those who knew Karen's penchant for self-importance could appreciate. Karen, resplendent in a wedding dress that could only be described as an over-the-top spectacle of lace, sequins, and layers upon layers of fabric, radiated an air of smug satisfaction. Every inch of her appearance was meticulously curated to exude superiority, from the perfectly styled hair to the dazzling jewelry that caught the light with every turn of her head. She moved with a grace that belied the absurdity of her surroundings, her every gesture calculated to impress, and perhaps, to assert her dominance over the space that was not rightfully hers. Yet, the true shock of the day was not reserved solely for Karen's audacious display of vanity, but for the cavalcade of characters that began to emerge from the fringes of the celebration. As the ceremony proceeded, the barn's old wooden doors creaked open to reveal a group of uninvited guests. Characters so outlandish that their presence seemed almost staged for maximum comic effect. Among them was a flamboyant street performer known as Rex, who had arrived with a troupe of similarly eccentric individuals. They set up an impromptu stage in one corner of the barn, complete with mismatched instruments and costumes that looked as if they had been scavenged from a circus clearance sale. Rex, with his exaggerated bow tie and a top hat that defied gravity, began to deliver a series of satirical monologues about love, society, and the absurdity of modern weddings. His words, laced with biting humor, were directed as much at Karen as at the hapless guests who were forced to listen. The timing could not have been more perfect. His performance, interspersed with ironic jokes and pointed commentary, cut through the pretension of the event like a knife through overripe fruit. The audience, initially taken aback by his abrupt entrance, soon found themselves laughing at the sheer absurdity of it all, though not everyone was amused. John, observing all of this from a discreet vantage point outside the immediate chaos, felt a mix of incredulity and vindication. Every garish decoration, every absurd guest, and every sarcastic remark added another layer to his mounting resolve. He could hardly believe that his once peaceful barn had been hijacked for this ludicrous display of hubris. The sense of injustice was palpable, and with each passing moment, the idea of retribution, sly, calculated, and oh so satisfying, began to take shape in his mind. Meanwhile, the reception was turning into a farcical parade of mishaps. The buffet table, laden with an array of questionable culinary choices, became a stage for culinary disasters. The extravagant cake, intended to be a centerpiece of perfection, wobbled precariously on its stand, its layers dripping with an overabundance of icing that looked more like a sugary waterfall than a delicately crafted dessert. As guests fumbled with forks and cutlery, the scene descended into a chaotic blend of laughter and whispered criticisms, all underscored by the discordant clinks and clatters of mishandled dishes. As the afternoon wore on, the true absurdity of Karen's wedding became increasingly apparent. The carefully orchestrated chaos was slipping out of control. The overly theatrical announcements, the relentless praise for Karen's impeccable taste, and the constant barrage of flattery had begun to wear thin on even the most patient of attendees. Every guest, in their own way, was starting to see through the veneer of forced celebration and into the underlying farce that was unfolding. John's heart pounded with a mix of indignation and a perverse sense of satisfaction. Here was the perfect stage for his long-awaited revenge, a chance to subvert the very spectacle that had so brazenly disrespected his personal domain. With every misplaced decoration and every sarcastic remark from the uninvited performers, John's determination to reclaim his barn grew stronger. He realized that this wedding was not just an insult to his property. It was a battle cry against pretension and a personal affront to his way of life. As the ceremony neared its climax, the barn seemed to vibrate with a mix of forced merriment and underlying tension. Karen's smile remained plastered on her face, a mask of oblivious superiority, as she moved through the crowd like a self-appointed empress overseeing her temporary kingdom. Yet, beneath the glitter and glamour, the seeds of retribution were already sprouting, quiet, cunning, and ready to burst forth at the most opportune moment. John's patience had long been tested by Karen's ostentatious displays of self-importance, and now was the moment for a truly mischievous comeback. With the barn transformed into a gaudy wedding venue that insulted everything he held dear, John decided that it was time to reclaim his territory in the most unpredictable way imaginable. And what better accomplices than his own band of unruly goats? Creatures as spirited and independent as their owner, whose antics were as legendary as the farm's rustic charm. It all began with a secretive smile as John watched the proceedings from a discreet distance. His mind, as sharp as the tips of the weathered barn beams, concocted a plan that was equal parts clever and absurd. Liberate the goats from their pens, let them roam free, and allow chaos to ensue. After all, who could have anticipated that a herd of goats would become the ultimate agents of ironic retribution? At precisely the moment when Karen's pompous proclamations reached their zenith, John discreetly unlocked the gate to the goat enclosure. The moment the latch clicked open, the goats sensed their impending freedom. With an almost conspiratorial gleam in their eyes, they began to trot out into the barn, as if summoned by the spirit of rebellion itself. The goats, known individually by quirky names like Billy, Nanny, and Scamp, now became an unstoppable force determined to overturn the carefully staged wedding. The initial chaos was as comical as it was unexpected. As the goats ambled into the barn, guests' chatter turned to bewildered murmurs. They had expected a refined, albeit extravagant, wedding reception, not a stampede of mischievous animals. Within moments, the goats began to explore every nook and cranny of the festively decorated venue. One particularly audacious goat, whom John had affectionately nicknamed Bandit for its knack for mischief, zeroed in on the centerpiece of Karen's vanity, her exquisite wedding dress. In a scene that could only be described as hilariously absurd, Bandit lunged at the dress, clamping its teeth onto the flowing fabric and darting away like a furry ninja. Gasps and startled cries filled the room as the bride-to-be, momentarily distracted from her vows, watched in disbelief. The dress, a shimmering spectacle of lace and silk that had been the pride of Karen's ensemble, now became a casualty of the goats' impromptu insurrection. As Bandit pranced around the barn, the stolen gown billowed behind it like a cape, turning the goat into an accidental superhero or supervillain, in a farcical twist of fate. But the mayhem was far from over. Soon, other goats joined in on the rampage, each contributing to a growing pandemonium that swept through the barn. One goat managed to nudge a table piled high with an assortment of meticulously arranged centerpieces, sending a cascade of faux roses and plastic peonies tumbling onto the floor. Another, with an uncanny sense of timing, dashed through the refreshment table, scattering canapes and sending champagne glasses clinking to the ground in a symphony of clattering chaos. Amidst the confusion, Karen's attempts to maintain control were as futile as trying to catch a greased pig. Standing at the altar with a forced smile, she barked orders at the staff, her voice drowned out by the cacophony of bleats and the clamor of overturned decorations. The guests, once enraptured by the carefully orchestrated ceremony, now found themselves participants in a surreal comedy of errors. Some ducked behind chairs, while others burst into uncontrollable laughter at the sheer absurdity of the spectacle. The entire wedding had transformed into an impromptu circus, one in which the goats were the uncontested ringmasters. John, hidden at the periphery of the chaos, could hardly suppress a grin as he observed the unfolding events. His plan, executed with a precision that only someone pushed to the brink of exasperation could muster, was working exactly as intended. Every stolen decoration, every toppled table, every misplaced bauble was a small victory against the pomp and circumstance that Karen had so arrogantly imposed upon his sanctuary. The scene grew even more surreal when one particularly bold goat, later dubbed Rebel by the amused onlookers, made a beeline for Karen herself. With a determination that bordered on the heroic, Rebel trotted up the aisle, his eyes locked onto Karen's prized possession, a designer clutch she held as if it were a talisman of her authority. Before anyone could intervene, Rebel clamped his teeth onto the clutch and pranced around in circles. Karen's shriek of indignation was matched only by the uproarious laughter of the guests. In that moment, it became glaringly apparent that the battle was no longer just about a misplaced wedding or an uninvited spectacle. It was a full-fledged revolt against the tyranny of pretension. The barn's ambience, once dominated by forced cheerfulness and a veneer of elegance, was now saturated with the raw, untamed energy of nature reclaiming its space. The goats, in their unbridled freedom, were not just causing mayhem. They were delivering a pointed message. Their antics were a satirical retort to Karen's grandiose display, a reminder that no amount of glitter or silk could suppress the wild, indomitable spirit of the land. Every flip of a hoof and every playful leap was an act of poetic justice, a calculated response to the encroachment on John's long-held sanctuary. Guests, now caught up in the hilarity of the situation, began to appreciate the irony of it all. Conversations shifted from polite chatter about Karen's impeccable taste to humorous speculations about the goats' newfound roles as agents of rebellion. "Who knew goats could be so politically active?" one guest remarked, eliciting laughter from those who recognized the underlying satire of the moment. The wedding, which had started as a pompous display of vanity, had metamorphosed into a living, breathing canvas of comedic retribution. Amid the tumult, John's inner monologue grew ever more triumphant. The chaos was his masterpiece, a carefully orchestrated revolt against the absurdity of a wedding that had no right to be there. He noted, with a wry smile, that the goats' behavior was almost as if they had been waiting for this moment all along, a moment when the scales of justice could be balanced not by human intervention, but by the unassuming yet potent power of nature. In every bleat and every dash through the barn, John's silent message was clear. When someone violates the sanctity of one's domain, nature itself rises in protest. By the time the dust and glitter began to settle, the barn had transformed into a scene of delightful disarray. Tables lay overturned, decorations were strewn about like confetti at a ticker-tape parade, and the stolen wedding dress, now slightly tattered, hung limply from Bandit's back. Even Karen's carefully curated image had suffered irreparable damage, her once commanding presence reduced to a state of disheveled bewilderment. The guests, now united in their shared experience of absurdity, began to applaud the goats' antics, as if to honor the unexpected triumph of natural chaos over contrived decorum. In that unforgettable moment, John's long-awaited revenge was complete. The goats, having played their parts to perfection, had not only disrupted Karen's grandiose plans, but had also delivered a biting commentary on the folly of imposing artifice on a world that thrived on genuine, if unruly, authenticity. The barn, John's cherished haven, had been restored in spirit, its rustic charm untainted by the pretensions of those who sought to exploit it for their own vanity. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the chaotic barn, the full extent of Karen's unraveling became unmistakably apparent. What had started as a flamboyant wedding spectacle was now an all-out free-for-all, a carnival of calamity that even the most ardent optimists could hardly have predicted. The very air seemed charged with a surreal mixture of jubilation and anarchy, as if the barn itself were laughing at Karen's misplaced pomp and circumstance. At the heart of the tumult stood Karen, whose carefully constructed facade of superiority was now crumbling under the weight of the unfolding absurdity. Gone was the radiant smile and the perfectly coiffed hair. In their place was a look of sheer disbelief and growing panic. With every passing moment, Karen's attempts to regain control over the disintegrating event grew increasingly desperate. She flitted about the barn like a headless chicken, barking orders at an audience that had quickly turned from polite guests into bemused spectators of a live-action farce. The first signs of total disintegration came when the wedding band, which had been playing a series of overly saccharine love songs, was drowned out by the bleating of the liberated goats and the clamor of overturned tables. Karen, ever the perfectionist, had insisted on a live performance to elevate the ceremony, but now the band's instruments lay abandoned on a table, their strings slack and their dreams of harmonious melodies dashed. Instead, the barn resounded with the chaotic symphony of clattering crockery, wild animal sounds, and the occasional burst of raucous laughter from the guests. Amid the bedlam, Karen attempted to rally her dwindling supporters. She clutched her designer clutch as though it were a lifeline, trying to exude authority and calm in the midst of the storm. "Everyone, please, calm down," she cried, her voice quivering as she struggled to assert some semblance of order. But her commands fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the incessant bleats of the goats and the mocking snickers of the guests. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to undermine her carefully orchestrated charade. John, watching from a discreet distance near the edge of the barn, could barely contain his amusement. His eyes twinkled with a mix of mischief and satisfaction as he observed Karen's futile attempts to rein in the chaos. For him, this was more than just a wedding gone wrong. It was a long-awaited moment of poetic justice. The very space he had nurtured, his sanctuary of rustic simplicity, was being reclaimed by nature's unruly spirit, and Karen was helpless to stop it. The turning point came when one of Karen's most ardent supporters, a snooty socialite named Victoria, tried to salvage the situation by ushering in a change of plans. With a trembling hand, Victoria suggested that they switch to a more relaxed reception, perhaps with an impromptu open mic session to lighten the mood. Karen, however, could not fathom a scenario where her meticulously planned wedding devolved into an amateur comedy night. In a fit of indignation, she dismissed the idea with a sharp retort, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is a wedding, not a circus," she snapped, only to be immediately undercut by the sound of a goat, later dubbed Rebel, galloping by and nipping at the hem of her gown. As the chaos escalated, the guests, once entranced by Karen's ostentatious display, began to seize the opportunity to indulge in their own brand of mischief. Tables were flipped with theatrical flair, glasses clinked against the floor in a celebratory rhythm, and whispered jokes about Karen's impending downfall spread like wildfire among the onlookers. The carefully constructed veneer of formality was peeling away, revealing a raw, unfiltered scene of delightful disorder. Every misstep, every overturned chair, and every stray goat's frolic became a part of a spontaneous celebration of the absurdity of it all. At the center of the pandemonium, Karen's once commanding presence had all but evaporated. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, darted around as she searched desperately for a way to reassert her authority. In one particularly memorable moment, she attempted to recapture the attention of the crowd by clambering onto the altar, her voice rising above the clamor as she declared, "This is my wedding. I demand respect." The declaration, instead of inspiring awe, was met with a chorus of sarcastic applause and laughter. Some guests even mimicked her proclamation in exaggerated tones, turning her plea for dignity into a punchline that reverberated throughout the barn. In a final, almost cinematic moment of retribution, the chaos reached its apex. The goats, now thoroughly emboldened, initiated what could only be described as a coup d'état against the remnants of Karen's decorum. One goat, affectionately known as Bandit for its earlier misadventures, made a beeline for the makeshift throne that Karen had set up, a plush chair draped in gaudy fabric that symbolized her misguided sense of grandeur. With an audacious leap, Bandit vaulted onto the chair, dislodging a cascade of sequins and satin in a shower of sparkling defiance. The sight was so ludicrous that even the most stoic of the guests couldn't help but burst into peals of uncontrollable laughter. Karen's reaction was instantaneous, a mix of shock and utter humiliation. Her carefully curated image of superiority lay in tatters before her eyes. The very symbols of her power, from the glittering accessories to the ornamental decorations, were now instruments of her downfall. In that moment, she realized with a bitter clarity that the world she so arrogantly attempted to control was now laughing at her, and there was nothing she could do to stop the tide of nature's revolt. John, hidden behind a weathered bale of hay and a smirk that could have rivaled the Cheshire Cat's, savored every second of Karen's collapse. This was more than a petty act of revenge. It was a triumph of authenticity over pretension, a resounding message that the natural order of life would not be subjugated by the whims of arrogance. The barn, with its worn wooden beams and rustic charm, had reclaimed its identity, casting off the trappings of forced elegance that Karen had so desperately clung to. As the final echoes of laughter and chaos mingled with the fading light, the wedding transformed into an emblem of poetic justice. Guests began to disperse, their conversations filled with humorous retellings of the day's events, while some even paid homage to the goats, the unexpected heroes of the revolution. In hushed tones and bursts of laughter, they recounted how the animals had disrupted not just a wedding, but an entire paradigm of shallow grandeur. Karen, now a shell of her former self, stood in the center of the barn with tears glistening in her eyes, a mix of genuine remorse and the dawning realization that her quest for control had led her straight into the arms of ridicule. In the aftermath of the mayhem, as the last of the decorations lay in ruin and the echoes of laughter slowly died down, she found herself confronted with an unexpected epiphany. Perhaps, in her relentless pursuit of perfection, she had lost sight of the value of authenticity and humility. The grandeur she so craved was nothing more than a fragile facade, one that could be shattered by the most unlikely of forces. In a final act of resigned acknowledgement, Karen lowered her head and whispered a feeble apology to the very air that had witnessed her downfall. It was a quiet moment, marked by the soft bleats of goats and the distant murmur of a disbanding crowd, a moment of introspection that, for all its understated nature, carried the weight of 1,000 lessons. In that moment, the message was clear. True power does not lie in the ability to command and control, but in the wisdom to understand and respect the natural order of life. John, now emerging from his hiding spot, stepped forward with a measured calm. His eyes, twinkling with a mix of triumph and a touch of pity, met Karen's tearful gaze. With a wry smile, he extended a hand, not as an act of mercy, but as a final, symbolic gesture of reconciliation between the world of pretension and the realm of genuine living. "Perhaps now you'll see," he murmured, his tone laced with a gentle sarcasm, "that respect isn't something you demand, but something you earn." The scene in the barn was nothing short of a revolution, one that had upended not only a wedding but the very notions of vanity and pride. As the twilight deepened and the stars began to twinkle in the vast expanse above, the barn settled into a quiet, reflective silence. The chaos had receded, leaving behind a poignant tableau of lessons learned and pride humbled. In the end, the downfall of Karen became more than just a personal vendetta. It evolved into a timeless fable of nature's unyielding spirit and the inevitable triumph of authenticity over artifice. The barn, scarred yet resolute, stood as a monument to that enduring truth, a reminder that no matter how grand the illusion, reality always has a way of asserting itself in the most unexpected and hilariously satisfying manner. Thus concluded the saga, a revenge story not marked by bitterness, but by a satirical humor that celebrated the unexpected twists of fate. Karen's descent into humiliation was a cautionary tale for all who dared to impose their will without regard for the natural order, while John's quiet victory underscored the enduring power of authenticity and the sheer unpredictability of life.